from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kriti Gupta, I'm Joe Matthew. Tonight, consensus between China and the U.S. before a high-stakes call. The news from the White House tonight after the administration and Chinese President Xi's negotiators reached a framework agreement on the sale of TikTok, just days before Xi and Trump hold a call amid sensitive trade negotiations.
Plus the moves China is now making against the world's most valuable company, NVIDIA. Officials in Beijing ruling the company violated anti-monopoly laws after a 2020 deal. What that makes for the chip maker and those trade discussions.
Also tonight, Federal Reserve Governor Stephen Myron. We're just hours away from a confirmation vote expected to put the president's chair of the Council of Economic Advisors on the Fed just in time for this week's meeting. Why Wall Street analysts say an interest rate cut is imminent.
And developments from Ukraine as Poland calls for a NATO-backed no-fly zone to protect Europe from Russian strikes. The potential of a broader war breaking out when we speak with former NATO ambassador Ivo Daalder coming up on the program. We begin tonight with news from the White House. The president just a short time ago posting on Truth Social about a second strike on a Venezuelan boat in international waters. Now, the president showing the world this video while writing, quote, the strike occurred while these confirmed narco-terrorists from Venezuela were in international waters transporting illegal narcotics headed to the United States. These extremely violent drug trafficking cartels pose a threat to U.S. national security. Be warned, if you are transporting drugs that can kill Americans, we are hunting you. Again, those comments coming on Truth Social from the president. The video you're seeing coming about 2 weeks after a first strike on another Venezuelan boat, with The Guardian and other news outlets reporting not all on board were gang members, as the administration is alleging. Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson, who joins us live right here in our Washington bureau as we cover that news, plus developments from the Oval Office. The president, of course, holding an event as we speak. We'll get to those developments soon. But, Wendy, let's start with the news on Venezuela. Just walk us through what we know.
Well, what we know is largely from the president's Truth Social post. And what he said was basically they blew another boat full of people out of the water, claiming that these were confirmed drug dealers. He calls them narco-terrorists, drug dealers, and that they were headed for the United States with a boatload of fentanyl. So far, we have no evidence from the Pentagon or the president of this claim. We have only the president's word to take for it. Mm-hmm. He did it again, as you said, 2 weeks ago, Kriti. And it's yet another one of these extrajudicial sort of, he's treating them as enemy combatants, is what I want to say, instead of criminal drug dealers. It used to be that the Coast Guard would interdict the boat, search it, arrest the people on it, and tow the boat back to the United States where it would be locked up with all the drugs. Now we're just killing them on the suspicion that they are drug dealers. So this has upset a few members of Congress. Lindsey Graham, Rand Paul were upset about the earlier one a few weeks ago for all the obvious reasons. But the leadership is behind the president again. So Congress won't complain about this.
Well, you know, we're going to talk to Congressman Marlin Stutzman in a moment to just get the input from a lawmaker on this. There were questions about the legality, to your point, of the first boat that was struck, because we did not board the vessel and investigate. We don't know exactly what's on board, and that doesn't seem to be stopping this administration. In fact, Marco Rubio told us to prepare for more.
Absolutely. And this could go on indefinitely. And, you know, the Venezuelan leader, Nicolas Maduro, you know, he is complaining about it. It puts him in sort of an untenable position because there he is defending alleged drug dealers, which only buys into Trump's point that this is an enemy combatant invading U.S. shores, not criminals delivering drugs to people who are voluntarily buying them. You know, and in Ukraine, people are being bombed for no good reason. Here, they are selling drugs to Americans.
Meeting a demand.
Meeting a demand, exactly.
It's an interesting point, Wendy. Thank you for being with us. Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson with her eyes on the White House. And as mentioned, we are live on Capitol Hill now with Republican Congressman Marlin Stutzman of Indiana, a member of the House Financial Services and Budget Committees, both of which are important to us here, Congressman. And so we'll have a few questions for you beyond this story. But I'd love to just get your initial reaction to this news that we have, in fact, attacked and destroyed another vessel in the Caribbean. How should we be looking at this? Are we at war in the Caribbean, and should Congress have a say?
Well, this has been a bipartisan effort for years to stop the drug trafficking into the United States. I mean, this is an illegal demand. It's not one that is, legal here in the United States. So I would argue that this is an illegal activity. The president has intelligence, and I believe that, he is acting on that intelligence. My hope is that he shares that with Congress because, we want to support, I want to support him dealing with drug traffic and the flow of drugs from Venezuela and other countries. It sends a message for sure. If you're out there trafficking drugs into the United States, to be aware that the president is taking this very seriously, and he should be, because we're seeing especially young people that are losing their lives too quickly because of an addiction to drugs. And this is one of the sad realities that we're facing here in America. And the one way that you put a stop to it is you stop the drugs from coming in.
Congressman, I want to focus on another part of the world, if we can. In about 4 days' time, we are due a phone call between President Trump and President Xi on trade tensions that have been brewing for quite some time. When that call comes about, what do you expect to be top of mind? How much of it will be exports focused? How much of it will be farming focused from your point of view?
Well, actually, agriculture is one of our largest exports from the United States to other parts of the world. And of course, China is a large consumer of that. One of the things that we want to make sure for our farmers and producers is that they have strong export markets. They're already dealing with a lot of other pressures economically. And the one thing that we can make sure that benefits our producers here in the United States is strong exports. And I hope this gets worked out. President Trump is a strong negotiator. He has stuck to his word, but he's also shown that he's willing to back off the tariffs in order to get to the negotiating table and to find a better way that's fair for both sides. So I'm looking forward to a fair result here that's good for American producers and the American people.
Well, we've got TikTok in the balance here as well. Congressman, news today from the Treasury Secretary that there is a framework in place to reach an agreement. And we want to be clear, there's not a deal to sell TikTok yet. But there were, of course, major concerns, and you know all about them, following a months-long debate about national security involving TikTok. I'm wondering if you think that this sale could, in fact, fulfill the spirit of that law, the divest or ban law, and if not, how you're sort of ranking the priorities of trade with China with national security here.
It is definitely a national security issue, and I believe that, not only has TikTok become an issue of national security, and again, what is it feeding into our kids' lives? What's it feeding into Americans' lives? The algorithms that social media has is very powerful, and I think that, just like we're talking about drugs coming into the United States, we also have to make sure that what is on social media, ag land is another one that a lot of states are putting prohibitions in place to ban China from buying farmland. Also, there's a bill here in Congress that would prohibit China from owning convenience stores on military bases because they're gathering data there. China's just nefarious, and they're looking for ways of stealing information, stealing data, and of course weakening America in a variety of different ways. I mean, even when it comes to vaping products, a lot of the products that come in from China that is sold into our C-stores for vaping is a very dangerous chemical. And so there's a lot of reasons to have a very skeptical eye with China. And I know that President Trump knows that. He has been, negotiator number one, making sure that we level the playing field with China, but also keep Americans safe.
Congressman, I want to zero in on the point you made when it comes to farming. China is actively going to Brazil and other parts of the world to find things like soybeans and other alternatives and goods that they get from places like Indiana, for example. Yeah. Where can your constituents, the farmers in your home state, go when it comes to finding demand for their products, if not China? Does it ultimately come to the government subsidizing that business even further?
Well, I think one of the things that we can do is that we can always, add value to corn and soybeans, whether it's energy, fuel production, or whether it's, raising our own beef. I mean, we have a shortfall on our beef supply here in the United States right now. There's opportunities like that by adding value in other processes rather than just shipping raw corn and soybeans overseas. Now, obviously, it's a huge market for us, but I think there's other markets as well that we could obviously be focusing on. India is, of course, a nation of 1 billion people. Europe, but I think that's where we need to up our game when it comes to our production, making sure that the quality that we produce here in the United States is at much higher levels. We're already there in some ways, but we can even do more. But I really think adding value to energy and also our ag production when it comes to animal production could be one of those places we could utilize our raw corn and soybeans.
Congressman, I have to ask you about the looming deadline to fund the government. Of course, your position on the Budget Committee gives you a unique perspective here, and I'm wondering what you're hearing. There's talk of a continuing resolution emerging later today, maybe tomorrow. November 20 is the date that we've been hearing as a potential timeline. Does that give us enough time? And is the $58 million that's being floated for lawmakers' security going to be enough money?
It's important. What happened last week with the assassination of Charlie Kirk, this was one of the president's best friends. And not only, was he assassinated, but President Trump, of course, was almost assassinated a little over a year ago. And so not only are emotions high, but concern is very high as well. Yeah. I think that money is money well spent and needed. But when it comes to getting the CR done, I think that President Trump put out a post today saying that a clean CR is what is acceptable, what he would want to see happen. And I think there's a lot of support for it. I know there's a couple of Republicans that have said that they've got their hesitations, but I think this is the best way forward. It's just difficult to pass new spending bills in the Senate with their 60-vote threshold. It just stops everything over there. And so I think that the clean CR is the right way forward. It freezes spending until we get through the next election, I guess, until the American people speak even more loudly in the direction they want this Congress to behave and act.
Right. Is November 20 the date we should be looking for, Congressman? At one point, the administration was asking for a full year. Would you vote for that?
They were. I would vote for a full year because I think that it's one of those pieces where we got to give certainty to the markets. There's a lot of tax policies in place with the Working Families Tax Cut Act, the Big Beautiful Bill that's in place. Of course, trade policy is pretty much stabilized and is coming into focus. If interest rates were down a little bit, that's probably the biggest issue I hear from my constituents, especially in the housing market, RV industry, retail space. If interest rates were down a bit more, they feel like people would have more confidence to go out and make those expenditures. I think a lot of people are just sitting on the sidelines, frankly, until the rates drop a bit, and hopefully they will do that soon. But these are all important pieces that the American people are watching every day, and they're feeling it. And so the longer we have stability with our budget out of Washington, I think that gives them that certainty.
All right, Congressman Marlin Stutzman of Indiana, we thank you so much for your time this evening. In the meantime, President Trump is proposing a major change to the information released by publicly traded companies. This morning on social media, the president posting, quote, companies and corporations should no longer be forced to report on a quarterly basis, but rather to report on a 6-month basis. This will save money and allow managers to focus on properly running their companies, end quote. President Trump previously proposed this idea during his first term in 2018. I want to turn now to Power Moves with Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, which is live from World Headquarters in New York. Romaine, walk us through that commentary. Walk us through the day.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, you brought up the 2018 proposal also under the Trump administration. And I really want to start there, Kriti, because he floated this idea in a social media post all the way back in August of 2018, basically saying that he had talked with a lot of corporate leaders and said that they want this. He actually asked the SEC to initiate the study, and it did. The SEC chairman at the time, Jay Clayton, ultimately decided that it was not necessarily appropriate to move away from a quarterly mandate to maybe something a little bit more softer, like an optional quarterly reporting system or a semi-annual mandate. But here we are again back in 2025. It did not have a big impact necessarily on the market, although there were plenty of opinions going around Wall Street as to whether this would actually reduce transparency in public markets, particularly at a time when we've actually seen lower liquidity in public markets as a lot more activity moves to the private markets. As for public markets, though, Creedy and Joe, we did have another record day on Wall Street, and this is the prelude to the big Fed meeting on Tuesday and the big Fed decision on Wednesday, and that really is where the market's head is at right now. Whether a rate cut will actually maybe potentially goose valuations even further. Remember, this was a day where we saw Google, Alphabet, if you will, cross the $3 trillion market cap threshold, joining just 3 other companies in that space. It was a day where we saw tech all around the board rally here, and the big setup heading into that meeting now isn't so much whether or not the Fed will actually cut rates, but the idea as to whether this will be the start of a prolonged rate-cutting cycle, a rate-cutting cycle that the president, of course, has asked for, and whether the economic backdrop actually supports it.
Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick. Great to have you, as always, Romaine. Coming up, the EU is weighing sanctions on companies in India and China that are enabling Russia's oil trade as part of a renewed call from President Trump. We'll discuss with Ivo Daalder, former U.S. ambassador to NATO, up ahead. But first, the Senate expected to vote tonight on Stephen Miron's Fed nomination, and we'll bring you the latest next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Kriti Gupta, I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Procedural votes for Stephen Miron's nomination to the Federal Reserve's Board of Governors set to begin in the Senate this hour, with a final vote, a floor vote, scheduled for later tonight. These are live pictures we're showing you on Bloomberg TV right now. Picture the Senate floor if you're with us on the radio. Joining us now with the latest here in our Washington bureau, Bloomberg's Michael McKee with his view on the Fed. Is this as good as done?
It's as good as done.
Yeah.
They're going to get it through. They've rejiggered the rules so they can bring it to the floor in time to get him into the Fed meeting that begins tomorrow
Pretty
at 9
remarkable.
a.m. It is pretty remarkable. I predicted a month or so ago that it wouldn't happen because the Senate is a sort of hidebound institution. But in this case, when Donald Trump snaps his fingers, they say, how high?
Is it as simple as that?
And that's what happened. So he'll be there. The question that we're all watching right now, though, is whether Lisa Cook will be there. Right. We're on docket watch. The administration has asked for a decision by tonight by the appeals court. They've requested a stay of the lower court judge's order that she could stay on the job while this is litigated. The court doesn't have to make a decision tonight, but because the meeting is tomorrow, it would make some sense for them to make a decision before the meeting starts rather than in the middle of it. But they could also hold it over till when the meeting is finished and say, we don't want this pressure on us. We're just going to take this as a regular case. So that's what everybody is watching at the moment to see whether we have 11 or 12 members of the Open Market Committee voting on Wednesday.
But as of right now, she's walking in those doors tomorrow.
As of right now, she is still a member of the Federal Reserve, according to Judge Cobb, who ruled in the district court that she could be a member of the Fed. She could remain on the job until the whole case makes its way through the courts. And the question is how fast would that happen if the administration should lose tonight? They're likely to go immediately to the Supreme Court and ask for an emergency ruling, which is not unusual because in the FTC case, Judge Roberts did an emergency ruling that said, yes, you can go ahead and fire this person while it's litigated. And tonight, everything comes around in a circle. The FTC commissioner's lawyers filed a brief with the Supreme Court saying that if you decide against my client, then you have undermined the case for Fed independence. So they've put the two cases together. We'll see how the court thinks about that.
Wow. All right. Bloomberg's Michael McKee. Never a dull moment in Fedland. We thank you so much walking us through this. He's going to be around for the next few days as we navigate some of the drama over at the Federal Reserve. In the meantime, while the Senate is set to vote on Miron's confirmation just hours from now, both chambers have just 7 working days left before a government shutdown. Republicans set to introduce a short-term funding bill to keep the government open until November. And still, Democrats are insisting on being included in funding bill talks, while Republicans are aiming to go at it alone. Joining us now live here in our Washington bureau is Bloomberg Opinion's Nia-Malika Henderson. Right here. Nia, lovely to see you, as always. Give us the odds of a shutdown right now.
Listen, the odds seem higher than the average, right? Going into these things, usually you're like, oh, they'll come to some agreement. The thing here to think about is what happened in March. Schumer ended up going into those negotiations with not much of a plan. He ended up caving, and he upset a lot of members of his party. And since then, you have a party that really is spoiling for a fight, particularly over Obamacare subsidies, over some of the cuts that you saw in the big, beautiful bill, as well around Medicaid. So I think they're increasingly high. There are not really many negotiations going on right now. We're probably going to see some sort of clean CR hit Congress this week. The House is out next week. So there's 7 days, right? And it's hard to imagine that the Democrats would sort of go along with a clean CR until November and say, oh, we want to get our ducks in a row. So I think, they're higher than 50-50, 60%, I think, odds of a shutdown.
Boy, all right. I want to ask you about the backdrop, this whole conversation in the wake of Charlie Kirk. Chris Murphy, the Democratic senator from Connecticut, who is frequently associated with gun control and of course, the Sandy Hook shootings, on Twitter, pay attention, he wrote. Something dark might be coming. This is a long thread with multiple posts. Murphy writes, the murder of Charlie Kirk could have united Americans to confront political violence. Instead, Trump and his anti-democratic radicals look to be readying a campaign to destroy dissent. There are stories today about a crackdown on so-called liberal organizations to try to find who funded this act. I don't know why anyone should believe that there was an organization behind it. Maybe we'll learn differently. But to what extent will this bring more corrosion to this relationship between Democrats and Republicans on Capitol Hill?
Listen, I think we are already seeing language from allies of Donald Trump that this is war, and Donald Trump blaming the radical left for this, saying that the radical right isn't as much of a problem. We'll see a vigil tonight. We'll see if there's any sort of bipartisan coming together around this. But Chris Murphy has been out front talking about Americans sleepwalking into autocracy. Obviously, Republicans don't agree with that. And so he sees a real dark turn coming from the White House. And listen, I think average Americans don't necessarily see a peaceful path forward here. If you look at polling, many Americans think that this is the beginning of something much more terrible, much more violence, and a crackdown from the administration. They don't necessarily see an off-ramp. If you listen to Donald Trump talking about, for instance, jailing Soros because he thinks he's behind some on a RICO case, if you listen to the language coming out of Donald Trump and his allies, it does sound like there's more coming in terms of a crackdown.
Should Democrats be scared?
Listen, I think they are scared. And listen, this is part of some of the conversation that's going on the Hill around security, right? Security being part of this government funding package, because they are nervous, literally scared around their lives, and this idea that there might be some sort of retaliation from not only people on the far right who are crazy and have guns, but then, of course, from the administration as well.
Pretty interesting to see some of the remarks from the vigil last evening at the Kennedy Center, which was represented by almost the entire administration. Creedy, Carrie Lake, among others, speaking at that event to say the violence has got to stop, and I'm not going to say our side is perfect, but damn it, this is coming from the other side. Now, as we're having this conversation, there's another one taking place on the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue at the White House. Nia-Malika Henderson, thank you so much. We want to bring you to the Oval Office right now, where President Trump has just signed an executive order that would bring troops to Memphis, much like we saw here in Washington, D.C. Other topics in the air now as he turns this over to questions from reporters live. This is Bloomberg.
I got like 8 times that amount. I got tremendous numbers of views. By the way, I want to say Charlie helped me. And Charlie was the one, get on TikTok. He used to say to me, get on TikTok. Charlie was unbelievable. So probably, and I did. I had somebody named TikTok Jack. And he'd put that camera, he said, just a real quick statement, sir, like 10 seconds or less. They didn't like anything over 10 seconds, but it worked. But Charlie is the one that really, and my son Barron also. And I have to say, Don, Erik, the whole group, it's important. And it can maybe even bring us closer to China. We had a very good meeting with China. I was surprised. I didn't expect it to that extent. And I'm going to speak again with President Xi on Friday, and I think that'll confirm things up.
Who's buying it? On Charlie Kirk and crime. On Charlie Kirk, do you plan to speak at the funeral, and what would your message be?
Well, I'm going on Sunday. We're taking a whole plane load, and having. I was invited on Saturday, but I said I'd rather save it for Sunday. We're going to have a stadium, and I'll bet that stadium is going to be pretty packed, maybe completely packed. It's going to be big, but I'm going to be at the stadium, and I guess I'll say a few words. I don't know, but I guess I will. But I knew him very well. He was an amazing guy. He was all about young people, getting them started right, and he was like a magnet for young people. They just attracted to him. He loved them, and they attracted to him. His wife is a tremendous person, by the way. He always had great respect for his wife. He got married. I didn't know he was getting married. I heard he got married, and he loved her. I tell you, he really loved her. She loved him, and I think she'll have something to do with keeping that whole thing going. Turning Point it became a very big deal, and I heard they had like 38,000. So he wanted to get it up to 20,000 chapters. That's a lot. That would have been a lifetime's work. I heard that over the last 4 days, they have 38,000 people wanted 38,000 chapters at colleges, schools, other places. Numbers that nobody's ever heard of numbers like that. So I think Turning Point could be, through what happened, this horrible act, it could be maybe bigger than it could have ever been had he been there. And I will say this: he'd be very happy if he saw what was going on. And there's some very good people, because I speak at Turning Point quite a bit. And Charlie would call me up. So the last time I spoke to him, he said, "Sir," and I think it was Phoenix, "Sir, could you get to Phoenix?" This was like in a day. I said, "Charlie, I'm the President of the United States. You're coming, asking me if I could speak tomorrow in Phoenix. You can't do that to me, Charlie." But usually I ended up going. He was great. He was a great guy, and he didn't deserve this. He didn't deserve this, believe me.
Ilhan Omar, after his assassination, called Charlie Kirk a reprehensible human being. Should she be stripped of her community assignments?
I would say, I think she's a disgraceful person. I think she's a disgraceful person, a loser. It's amazing the way people vote. I know it's people from her area, maybe of the world. I don't know. They got here and they vote her in. It's hard to believe, but I think she's a disgusting person.
And one more question, if I could. A lot of these, in recent of these trans shooters that we've seen over the last couple incidents, this flag right here is up and down 14th Street. This is what would be a trans flag. A lot of people are very threatened by this flag. It means a lot of different negative things to people, violence. Would you be opposed to taking this flag down, up and down the streets of D.C.?
Well, I wouldn't be. Then they'll sue and they'll get freedom of speech stuff, so that'll happen. But I would have no problem with it. I will say, and Steve might just mention this, Todd, you might mention it too, because we're putting out an order. Freedom of speech means you could burn the American flag, which I think is horrible. But I noticed something over the last little while. As you do this, you start noticing things that you wouldn't normally think. It really causes unrest and violence when they burn American flag. So the American flag, I wanted anybody burns the American flag, go to jail based on freedom of speech, goes to jail immediately. But the freedom of speech protected them, right? And that's been argued a couple of times. And it's one of those things. But you know what? Hasn't been argued, and we're going to be arguing it, I think, very soon. And that's the violence. They incite violence. So I saw it just yesterday. They burned the American flag, and people that were there were fine. And all of a sudden, they're going crazy, and there's fist fights. It wasn't in Memphis either.
President Trump speaking live in the Oval Office in a back and forth with reporters. We wanted to put an ear on that, as we'll have much more on all the topics he was discussing with our panel coming up. Most recently, it was creating a conversation about Charlie Kirk and the president's plans to attend the funeral in Arizona this weekend. He says he's going to have a plane full.
He was asked if he was going to speak at the funeral.
Yeah.
He didn't quite comment on whether or not he would. We know J.D. Vance is expected to attend, as well as I'm sure many Republicans.
And on this day that J.D. Vance, in fact, hosted Charlie Kirk's old podcast is his radio show with a lot to say, and a number of members of the administration weighing in on the program. And we'll have more on that as we get closer to this weekend.
Absolutely. In the meantime, let's go to some of the stories we're watching in today's Power Brief. Maureen Comey, the longtime New York federal prosecutor and daughter of former FBI Director James Comey, has sued the Justice Department and White House over her firing in July. Comey filed a complaint today saying there was no legitimate explanation for her firing, alleging she was terminated because, quote, her father is former FBI Director James B. Comey, or because of her perceived political affiliation and beliefs, or both, end quote. Maureen Comey has worked on high-profile sex trafficking cases, including against Jeffrey Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell, and Sean Diddy Combs. She claims her firing violates her constitutional rights.
Shares in Tesla jumping over 3% today after Elon Musk purchased more than 2.5 million shares in the company, totaling around $1 billion. The move signals Musk's commitment to the company as the board prepares to vote on an unprecedented pay package that could grant him as much as $1 trillion in stock over the next decade. Tesla shares have now reached their highest price since January 22nd, with the stock up about 4% on the year, though Musk has also cautioned the company could see a few rough quarters after U.S. government incentives for EV purchases expire later this month.
And President Trump has suggested there could be financial consequences after New York Governor Kathy Hochul endorsed Democratic mayoral candidate Zohran Mamdani in a New York Times op-ed on Sunday night. In her endorsement, which has been echoed by Maryland Senator Chris Van Hollen, Hochul commends Mamdani's commitment to affordable housing and a united Democratic front. Trump wrote on Truth Social earlier today, quote, Governor Kathy Hochul of New York has endorsed the little communist Zohran Mamdani running for mayor of New York. This is a rather shocking development and a very bad one for New York City. How can such a thing happen? Washington will be watching the situation very closely. No reason to be sending good money after bad, end quote.
That was little with 2 Ds. Within the next hour, Statuary Hall, just outside of the House floor in the U.S. Capitol, will be filled with members of Congress as an all-member vigil is being held for conservative activist Charlie Kirk. Of course, the president was just talking about the vigil held just hours after FBI Director Kash Patel said investigators had found physical evidence connecting the suspected gunman to the fatal shooting of Charlie Kirk in Utah last week, with Vice President Vance stepping in for Kirk on his eponymous podcast to pay tribute to him today. We go now live to Capitol Hill, where Bloomberg's Erik Wasson is standing by as lawmakers begin to convene for the Kirk vigil, while the clock ticks down to a possible government shutdown at the end of this month. We'll have more on that in a second. Erik tells us, though, what the mood is like on the Hill with this vigil set to happen soon. And Erik, as we just discussed with Congressman Stutzman, a new call to spend $58 million to better protect, to better secure lawmakers.
Well, actually, I have to correct you a little bit there, Joe. It's $58 million for the executive and judicial branch, but there is talk of adding potentially even more for lawmakers. Only congressional leaders have full security details. Speaker Johnson said it could take 5,000 new officers to give every member of Congress a security detail, and that's out of the question. But the numbers so far are pretty low. It's $20,000 per year per lawmaker right now available for security. So they may up that in this must-pass spending bill, but those talks are still ongoing, and the spending bill, which we anticipated would be released today, is not coming out because of the ongoing talks on this issue.
Erik, we've heard from members on our show, but also throughout Bloomberg programming and, of course, across Washington, D.C., that the odds of a shutdown have materially increased over the weekend. Is that a fair assessment from where you are?
I think so. The real key question is for Senate Democrats. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer in March threatened to shut down, but then ultimately allowed 10 members of the Democratic caucus to vote for a stopgap continuing resolution that the government's now running under. He's again making the same noises, this time about health care. There's a sense among Democrats that one of the key issues here is Obamacare premium subsidies, which expire at the end of the year. And if only President Trump and Republicans really woke up to the political dangers, they'd come to the table and do a deal. This could see many middle-class members see as much as a 75% increase in their monthly premiums, and those notices go out November 1st. But so far, Republicans are not having it. They're putting forward a clean spending bill without real riders, other than this lawmaker security provision, through probably November 21st, and saying, Mike Johnson saying to us earlier in the hall, that it would be a December conversation to talk about those expiring Obamacare premiums.
Should we be looking at November 20th if this is, in fact, going to be a continuing resolution, Erik? The White House at one point was asking for a full year.
Yeah, no, it's not going to be that. It's definitely going to be in November. The appropriations committees, really do not want to see a long-term continuing resolution, which is really continuing Biden-era policies. They want to update. The Republicans want to update those to more Trump-related policies for the year. The argument for those who favor long-term continuing resolution is that the Office of Management Budget can go in and unilaterally cut funds, but that's really up to the courts, and the courts very well could rule this idea of impoundment as being unconstitutional. So it's a sort of risky strategy. Appropriators would rather see the ability to finish those full-year bills, to update the Pentagon and other budgets, and they'll be given some running room till November to do that. But history has proven that in the past that November continuing resolutions bleed into December, and we could see like sort of a Christmas drama, which is typically unfolded in the past.
All right, Bloomberg's Erik Wasson walking us through the dynamics of Capitol Hill. We thank you so much. Joining us now with their reaction to the story and more this evening's political panel, Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis, partner at Stonecourt Capital and Republican strategist, alongside Democratic analyst Jeanne, Sheehan, Zaino, Democracy visiting fellow over at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center, both joining the program. Rick, I'm going to start with you, just off what Erik Wasson there told us from Capitol Hill. He's saying that even though the White House and Republicans are pushing for a full-year CR, we're not going to get there. Do you agree?
Yeah, there are actually Republicans who want to go back to getting these appropriation bills done. They've been making progress on them. There are only a few that really need to get done. And I think the attitude is just get us till November. We can finish up the regular appropriations bill and put our stamp policy-wise on congressional spending. And I think that really is a very big motivator for this group right now.
Where's Chuck Schumer on this? Jeanne, he got in a lot of trouble back in March when he did not do what Democrats thought he would do, siding with Republicans. Is he a no vote as for now?
I think we're probably going to see a filibuster in the Senate if they do not include the subsidies that you were just talking to Erik about, and some of the other Democratic requirements there, including rescissions issues. I think that both sides are sort of dug in at this point. And with 2 weeks, but 7 legislative days, we are moving very, very quickly to what could be a shutdown. And I think what Republicans in the House are thinking is that they can sort of mirror what they did earlier in the year and push this through. But that's also risky because their margin is very, very thin in the House, just 1 or 2 votes, depending on who shows up if Massey votes no.
So, Rick, talk to us a little bit about this kind of Democratic ask here. What are the odds it gets through?
I think slim short term, right? So the deadline's going to come. Let's say it's going to be 21st. Democrats are going to ask for these ACA subsidies. And Republicans will make the case, hey, we're not marking up anything. This was a Biden budget. Everything that's in here was done with your blessing in the Biden administration. All we're doing is extending it a couple months so that we can do the work on, a bipartisan appropriations bill. You want to talk about subsidies? Put them in the appropriations bill. Do it the appropriate way. I think it's going to make Democrats very uncomfortable because it is their budget that they're going to vote against. And I think that Republicans will make good use of that in the public domain. And I think ultimately it's not sustainable for Democrats to shut down government over something that's an add-on.
Interesting. Jeanne, as lawmakers get together for the vigil that we were just talking about for Charlie Kirk, there's reporting today that the administration is laying the groundwork for a crackdown on so-called left-wing groups. I don't know exactly which groups these are. For the most part, we hear about George Soros, who's been associated with a potential racketeering charge, according to President Trump. But I'm wondering where this is going from here and the extent to which it's going to make the debate over government spending and any of the other policies that we talk on this program more difficult than it already is on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to believe we're talking about things getting more difficult on Capitol Hill, but I totally agree. I mean, things have pretty much ground to a halt, considering we can't even guarantee we'll get a budget through, and you add this layer, and I think it's very troubling because what's going to happen is, of course, Democrats and people on the left are going to say, wait a minute, there have been plenty of examples of people who are Democrats, who are liberals, who have been victims of horrible, horrible political violence, including the Speaker of the House, her husband, including the state lawmakers out in the Midwest. I mean, the list goes on, and political violence does not just focus on one side or the other. And so for the administration to put forward a legislative package that addresses just one side is just going to be a recipe for more contention in the legislature. We do need Congress to act. We need them to act on things like regulation of things like Discord, which played a big role apparently in this, gun control, right? We do need regulation of social media. All of these things the government and Congress can address, but it's got to be addressed in a bipartisan and common sense fashion, not just attacking one side or the other.
Well, Jeanne, what's going on through the minds of prominent Democrats? I'm thinking of AOC, for example, Bernie Sanders, even Zohran Mamdani, as Democrats are being blamed, and you're seeing this kind of discord being sown, as you point out. What's going through the minds of them?
You know, I think they feel that it is unfair to cast blame for the actions of one individual on an entire political movement or a political side. To be fair, the left has done that to the right as well. And that's why we need people to stand up like Governor Cox, a Republican of Utah, did, and say we all have to take responsibility for where we are. Certainly, I believe leaders have to take responsibility, and we have to take common sense steps to engage in government action that secures all of us, not just one side or the other. You know, throwing barbs, whether it's the president or anybody else, at one side is simply going to make the situation that much worse. And that, to me, is antithetical to any definition of leadership.
You can weigh in on the blame game to the extent that you want to, Rick, but we keep hearing that a lot of lawmakers are terrified right now. You spent a lot of years on Capitol Hill working with John McCain and others. Is it time to have a more robust conversation about security? Does each member deserve a detail?
Yeah, look, I think the administration did the right thing and immediately put together a package of funding to go into this continuing resolution as the one add-on that was timely for the moment we're in. Yeah. There's no question that we need to move toward a dialogue how to solve issues related to political violence. It's not just criminal violence happening in cities anymore. Yeah. This is a category that you have way too many examples to put out on both sides. That being said, I don't think this administration is really interested in that dialogue. You're right. Governor Cox, I think, has handled this situation in Utah as well as anyone I've ever seen in politics to try and keep the temperature down at a time when it could get really out of control. Mm-hmm. I think we have the worst ahead of us yet. There are people who want to take political advantage of this horrific situation, and they will get a voice in this administration. So I think we need to be prepared for a wrenching debate with a forecast of using politics to define it, and that's not going to move the country forward.
Wow. So it sounds like you don't see the answer necessarily security, but getting to root causes, which is a much longer project.
Yeah, look, I mean, I'm surprised, actually, that the administration didn't take advantage of the situation they have with TikTok to get it into American hands, to say, hey, this is an opportunity to try and have a conversation around what we can do to make TikTok better for our children, especially young women. And they didn't go there at all. So, look, my guess is it's not in this agenda for this administration to try and tamp down the fervor that exists now. And if anything, I think they see it as a cudgel to use in this midterm election coming up.
Wow. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, we thank you, as always, for the analysis here on Balance of Power. And coming up, as the president is set to embark on his trip to the UK tomorrow, the EU is grappling with how to navigate President Trump's demands on Russian oil. We'll dive into this next with Ivo Daalder, former U.S. ambassador to NATO. On that and the latest strike against a boat in Venezuela, it's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Kriti Gupta, I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Tonight, the president releasing a video showing U.S. forces striking a second Venezuelan boat. allegedly carrying narcotics to the U.S. We're going to get into that in just a moment. But first, we go to Europe after Poland made a strong recommendation today that could change the course of the war in Ukraine, as Poland's foreign minister said NATO should consider imposing a no-fly zone. Comments coming less than a week after Russian drones penetrated Polish airspace, something that has occurred repeatedly throughout the year.
Meanwhile, former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, a Trump ally, is calling for NATO troops to head into Ukraine. And Russia holding major war games in Belarus amid NATO tensions. The last time the Kremlin held a military display of this kind, it was back in 2021 ahead of its invasion of Ukraine. Joining us now is the perfect voice for more here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Ivo Daalder, former U.S. ambassador to NATO under the Obama administration and now senior fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center. Ambassador, thank you so much for your time this evening. Poland is talking about a no-fly zone in Ukraine. Last week, they were talking about invoking Article 4. From your perspective, how close are we to invoking Article 5?
Well, we're not there yet, and the whole point is not to get to that point. The reason that a country invokes Article 4 is when it says, I want to consult with my allies because I think there's a threat to my security or potential political independence. And when 19 drones are shot at your country, quite intentionally, there's no doubt that 19 drones don't go missing anywhere, even though they were unarmed. You get worried. You get worried about where the alliance is. So I think this proposal from the Polish foreign minister is a good one. If you're going to be able to defend your territory, the best way to do that is to make sure that the missiles and drones that are heading your way across Ukraine don't reach it. And if that, by the way, then helps secure the skies above Ukraine, so much the better. They need all the help we can get. So I think this is a necessary step. It's an appropriate step also to remind Russia that they're playing with fire in ways that came ricochet back on themselves.
Well, of course, it takes a lot of resources, a lot of effort to stand up a no-fly zone, Ambassador. And I'm very curious to hear your thoughts more about who would carry this out. Would there be American airplanes involved here if this was, in fact, a true NATO operation? Or are we simply talking about Europeans? And you know what the big question is, everybody would ask, what happens if somebody gets shot down? Where are we then?
Well, if you operate over Ukrainian territory, certainly the parts of Ukrainian territory that is controlled by the Ukrainians, the chances of the Russians actually shooting one of those planes down is pretty small. It's not zero, but it's pretty small. I think this could be a NATO operation in which countries individually decide whether they want to participate. Already, you have the French, the Germans, the Dutch, the Danes, the Brits, and the Poles committing air power to the defense of Poland and the eastern flank. The Romanians are doing the same with regard to their own country. Of course, the United States could participate, but up to this point, it hasn't. It didn't send in the Air Force to protect Poland. When there was a stray or not so stray drone that went into Romanian territory just over the weekend. The U.S., which in fact has forces in Romania, as it has in Poland, did not participate in following that drone over that territory. So while it could be a NATO operation, which would mean it would be under NATO command and control, it would allow for NATO reconnaissance airplanes and intelligence to be used. The actual overflight and combat aircraft that would be involved need not be American, although if I were the president of the United States, I would want to send Russia a message, not that we're divided with our allies, but that we're united with our allies, and I, of course, would want to participate.
Ambassador, as we're monitoring the developments in Eastern Europe, President Trump talked about a second strike on a Venezuelan boat. Just walk us through whether there's a connection, a through line between what's going on in the Caribbean and the American relationship with Nicolas Maduro and what we're seeing in Eastern Europe. Does this impact the U.S.'s posturing with Russia?
I don't think it directly impacts, other than to say, sent the signal to Russia that if you send drones into a NATO territory, a NATO allies territory, we may call that a mistake. And on the other hand, we go after totally unarmed boats, and we don't have a particular good sense of who was in the boat, what was in the boat. that information isn't even available about the boat that that was shot a couple of weeks ago out of the water, including when U.S. officials were talking to Congress about this. So I think what it is sending a message to Vladimir Putin, frankly, to Xi Jinping, is we're concerned about security in our hemisphere and around our border. We're worried about drugs coming into our border and immigration. What you do in other parts of the world, you do. That's for other people to decide. There are reports that the new defense strategy is going to emphasize the defense of the homeland and the Western Hemisphere. We're back to sort of the 1830s when we talked about the Monroe Doctrine, and the rest of the world apparently is no longer of importance to us. Of course, the lesson we learned in the 20th century is that wars that happen in Europe don't tend to stay in Europe. They at some point involve us as well.
That's quite a statement from a former ambassador to NATO. In our remaining moment or so here, Ambassador, could this be the start of a war in the Caribbean?
I don't think so. I don't hope so. But I also believe that if Maduro thinks that this is a direct threat to his power, he's going to do what he thinks is necessary to defend himself, and that will take major military power to either overthrow him or to have regime change. We don't have a happy history with regime change when it comes to the U.S. military. We haven't had it since the end of the Cold War, and frankly, we didn't do a very good job of it before, during the Cold War. And the reason is very simple. It's very, very hard, not just to get rid of leaders, but then to have a new society emerge that is supportive of what we try to do. The best internal change comes internally, not from outside.
All right, Ivo Daalder, former U.S. ambassador to NATO under the Obama administration, now senior fellow for Harvard's Belfer Center. We thank you so much for your time this evening. For more on all these stories we discussed here this evening, check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
There's a lot in there this evening. It's been a busy Monday, and I suspect tomorrow will be a busy Tuesday with the president on his way to the United Kingdom. We'll have a lot more here. So thank you for joining us on Balance of Power. We're just getting started, and we'll meet you back here tomorrow. Alongside Preeti Gupta, I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. This is Bloomberg.